So let's have a look at some Wonder Woman comic panels, get a sense of kind of the stories. And this is from an early, I believe the first actual issue of Wonder Woman. Like there's the origin story, which is part of something else, and then she gets her own Sensation Comics. And I love this. They're in this fight, and she says, "Let's pile them up, Steve. It'll be easier to count our prisoners." And Steve Rogers, and these two are in love. His response is, "What a woman!" Right, showing admiration for her power and skill. And then there's this wonderful kind of reversal where Steve Rogers is Captain America. My mistake. I love this. He is injured, and it says, "Working at feverish pace, Wonder Woman uncovers Steve Trevor. Are you hurt, Steve? Why didn't you jump like I did? Jump like you? What am I, a kangaroo?" So he's acknowledging, her physical power being above his own. "Your leg is broken. My leg does seem bent a glit, but I'm glad of it. At least it shows you care," right? So it's this really fascinating reversal, right? Maybe from what you would see in Superman or some other comic of this gender dynamic. And there's lots of different ways you can interpret this, lots of different ways you can understand it, right? Like I said, you wouldn't want to simply say, well, this is a feminist and stop there. You wouldn't even want to say this is about women's empowerment and stop there. You'd want to keep going. I'm not going to keep going because the idea is to just help you kind of think about these things, think more deeply. And just to give you another sense, I think this conversation is really fascinating, right? Steve's tied up. She's letting him go. "Hold still while I untie you, Steve. Though I really ought to keep you. I'm an Amazon after all, maiden after all, and it's open season for hunting husbands." "Well, that wouldn't make me mad. I'm getting tired of proposing to you anyhow." "Haha, thanks for the compliment, Steve, but I think I'll stay a career girl for a while yet. There's too much to be done without me trying to keep house in a man's world." And again, this is kind of fascinating because if you read the comics, they do love, they're in love. But there's this idea that because of the current environment, that prevents them from actually marrying, right? Prevents them from being together romantically. Because it would pit her duty as, like she says, a career woman, but I mean, she's got an important job to do with, okay, now you're a housekeeper. So there's something really to this. There's a kind of depth is what I'm trying to say. And that's why I'm trying to complicate this. If you were just to simply say this is feminist and just stop there, it's like, well, we need to go a bit deeper, right? We need to go a bit deeper than that. So one thing, and the documentary goes into this detail, or they don't go into this detail. They just mention it and stop there. But that's the issue of images of bondage in Wonder Woman. And one thing I want to point out, first of all, when I talk about this, and I'm glad this is recorded, I would be very uncomfortable doing this in a classroom looking at students. I've had to deal with Wonder Woman before in class, and it was all kind of awkward. Especially because my specialty, I study religion. A lot of the people I study were like, what can I say? I study a couple from early 19th century Korea that chose to marry, but to never consummate their marriage. And they had, I won't go into the details why, but that was their choice to do. They thought would better help them to serve God. So it's kind of weird to go from that to trying to figure out how to talk about bondage. But there we go. But the key thing was those documentaries will talk about bondage, but then don't actually look at the video. I'm sorry, at the details of what's going on. So for example, if you look at a lot of the early Wonder Woman comics, there's actually not that much bondage. It shows up more later, and the issue with it is the importance of context, right? How does context work within it? How does it work within the story? So to give you an example, this is one of the first times that bondage actually comes up. And it's interesting that Wonder Woman, Steve, is the one who gets tied up first, right? And then they tie her up. But it's emphasized that, these guys, they're security for American girls. That's our motto, ha, ha, ha. And then I'm just going to let them do this so I can figure out what's going on. And then it's interesting, they're going to inject Steve Trevor with truth serum. And then she hits these guys, and then immediately bursts her bonds. They don't even show her doing it. And then she's free. Later on, basically, this person here threatens to kill Steve if she doesn't surrender. So they again tie her up. But again, just in the very next panel, she is again frees herself. And she said, I like this. They should have used chains. It would be more fun breaking them. So it's within the context, this actually kind of makes sense. And the argument is, hey, this woman is being tied up by men, but she breaks the chains herself. She doesn't wait for someone else to break them for her, right? She's rescuing Steve. Steve doesn't usually rescue her. And so this is very important. You don't want to just read isolated panels. You need to look and try and understand the context a bit more. And to give you a sense of other things, there's this, one of the major plots is that there's a woman who's like enslaving other women and taking away their free will. And she wants to help them. Wonder Woman wants to help these women become free. And in order to help them and the villainess, right? She also wants to help the villainess who's doing this. And it's interesting that they chose a woman for the villain. They basically kind of make this prison, but the prison is not for punishment. The prison is for reform, right? So this is something that's really important to kind of think about when you read these things. And a lot of times she uses her powers, which are often about, we'll talk more about this later, but about ideas of submission and dominance. She tries to use them to help people to become free. So there's a lot going on here, and we'll look later at Marston. William Marston. We'll look at his intent, but one thing we have to stress, once these images are there, we also have to point out that people could receive them in a different way, right? Someone could read this, right? If you're reading it the way the author intends, I think you're supposed to get the idea, that this woman is a powerful woman. She is in control of the situation, even though the men don't think she is, and she breaks out. That's, I think, the author's intent. As much as we can know, I think that makes sense. But someone could ignore all this and just find this an erotic scene, completely ignoring that, right? So I just want to point that out, right? You have the author's intent, but then you have how people receive it. And those are two things you want to keep apart. And I think that's important because they do point, a lot of the people who read Wonder Woman were boys. And, some of those boys, this maybe did encourage them to be feminists or to respect powerful women. For others, maybe they got something else out of it, right? It's hard to tell. Now, also, though, we have to understand that there's kind of an in-between space, right? There's what the author is intending, but what else is going on, right? Sometimes I think things bleed through. An author might include things that aren't really intentional. They might be subconscious. So, I think this is an interesting image. Is this meant to be humorous? What's going on here? But what I think is fascinating is, how does this change if you take out the "I'll obey you"? Right? This just could be meant to be kind of funny, right? Just could be meant to be silly. Now, I don't think it's funny now, but in the 1940s, if you look at the imagery, this is considered kind of funny. But it's this interesting thing that there's this tendency of people in Wonder Woman comics to say, "I'll obey you." And you can read into that what you want. I think you got to look at kind of what Marston's ideas are. But there's this kind of issue. What is necessary for the story and what seems unnecessary? So if you have stuff, like I said, this to me seems necessary for the story. That's why I tend to read that as just part of the story, part of the ideals, the author's intent, what Marston is trying to get through. But this, I think, is interesting because I don't think it's strictly necessary. This is a joke. Why is this here? She doesn't actually say anything really about obedience. It makes sense to just say, "I'm cured," because she says, "I'm going to cure you." I don't know. Maybe I'm overanalyzing things. I'm a professor. That's what we do. But this is kind of curious. So this is something to think about. And to give you an example, again, you may be familiar with C.S. Lewis, who is is a Christian apologist, right? He's very clear that his stories are meant to kind of advocate a Christian worldview and are meant to kind of convince you that that's the worldview that you should adopt. What's interesting, though, is he has this thing called the Space Trilogy, and there is this part of it, that hideous strength, and it includes a bondage scene, basically. And I was really just like floored when I read it, because I'm a big C.S. Lewis fan. I love Lewis, and I was just really shocked. I'm like, why is this here? It's completely unnecessary. Well, then later on, before his conversion to Christianity, he had expressed an interest in scenes like that. And so when we bring that in, you say, oh, that's kind of his subconscious bleeding through, right? Even though he's become this great Christian apologist, that part of him, that early part of him, it's still there. And it just kind of slipped out here. So that's something to remember. But we should also note, there's sometimes also just practical constraints with comics. So I think, it's interesting that they don't actually show her breaking her bonds. They just say that she does. And I just wonder if that was a space issue of space consideration. One thing I also want to point out in terms of context, this actually turns out to be a woman. A lot of Wonder Woman's villains that she deals with are actually women. And I think there's, again, a lot of places you can analyze with that. But again, my point here is just to kind of complicate things, not to say this is the way it is, but just to kind of, like I said, complicate things. So, that's kind of, we'll talk about Marston's ideas, but then there's also these kinds of curious things that kind of peek through, that it's hard to argue go with any conscious intent, and that go more with, let me just give you an example. I think that's better than me just trying to explain it. So you have in one of the comics, you have Diana, Wonder Woman, come back to the Amazon as a kind of Amazonian Santa Claus, basically. She's brought them gifts, and the joke is that they misunderstand the gifts. What happens, though, is if you get caught spying on Amazon Santa, you are penalized. How are you penalized? Well, tie me up, goddess. I must pay the penalty and remain bound until morning. And then you must become a little hunted deer. You're a game girl, Zoe. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that Zoe has to dress up like a deer so Wonder Woman can hunt her. Wonder Woman then ties her up and carries her back. They then hang them up and skin them, right? Skinned. You'll make a lovely chicken, darling. Wait until I give you a crisp skin. You make my mouth water. How about feeding me to myself? And then they tie them up to make like a pie. That doesn't go anywhere with this. And then they said, now you're going to get up and dance for us. And if you don't, we're going to cook you some more. I don't know. Interesting stuff. You can make of this what you will. My point here is just, I want to stress that you've got the author's intent. And as we'll talk about, there's this kind of issue of social reform. You also have ideas of reception, right? You've also got, and you've got things that are kind of curious and that maybe that slip out of the author. And that maybe tells us something about the author. And what this tells us, I'm not sure. But again, going back to this idea of intent, there's these interesting times where Wonder Woman muses, right? And some of these things are fascinating. This is where, it gets tricky to say she's a feminist icon. If girls want to be slaves, there's no harm in that. Whoa. The bad thing for them is submitting to a master or to an evil mistress like Paula. A good mistress would do wonders with them. I'll just leave that as it is. The other, some girls love to have a man stronger than they are, make them do things. Do I like it? I don't know. It's sort of thrilling, but isn't it more fun to make the man obey? These are interesting ideas. And again, this would be an interesting thing to kind of look at for a research project, to look at it deeply. Like I said, a lot of times with Wonder Woman, it just is like feminist icon. And it's like, well, there's some other things there. Now, what's there has a lot to do with William Marston. And that's someone who we're going to pick up with in the next section.